Our text for today is from 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. Sometime later, Absalom got a chariot and horses for his own use, along with 50 men to run ahead of him. Absalom would get up early and stand by the side of the road that went through the city gate. Whenever anyone had a lawsuit to bring before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him, "What city are you from?" When the person would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel," then Absalom would say to him, "No doubt your claims are correct and valid, but the king won't listen to you. If only I were made a judge in the land." Absalom would continue, "Then anyone with a lawsuit could come to me, and I would give them justice." Whenever anyone came near to Absalom, bowing low out of respect, he would reach his hand out, grab them, and kiss them. This is how Absalom treated every Israelite who came to the king seeking justice. This is how Absalom stole the hearts of the Israelites. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hey, High Rock, I'm so glad to be with you today, digging into this text and inviting God's Spirit to speak to us. Our sermon series is exploring the complicated history of King David. David's life is marked by huge triumphs and failures. His life and legacy are complicated. As the king, when we come to talk about David, we find ourselves asking how much good and bad can coexist in one person, in one family, in one nation. The passages for today get right to the heart of that question. There's a lot of sin in David's life and his family. It gets really complicated, so you may be wondering why we'd spend so much time on someone and something so messy. Well, because when we take an honest look at this complexity in David's life and in the Bible, it helps us see our own stories more clearly. We've heard about how David had a humble but anointed beginning, how he used his gifts as a leader, how his relationship with Saul and unjust persecution forced him to wrestle with his ego and his integrity. We watched his rise to public prominence. Up until 2 Samuel 11, most of David's story has been about his public triumphs, the parts of his history that are easy to tell. But chapters 11 and 12 move to the part of history that is incredibly painful and private. As Pastor Dave shared last week, David uses his privilege to stay safely out of the war he's supposed to be commanding. He abuses his power and position to summon Bathsheba to his palace, where he rapes her, tries to cover it up, and denies his responsibility to their unborn child. He murders her husband as a final attempt to maintain his image. It's hard to believe how far David has fallen, that this is the same David who spared Saul's life multiple times, even when Saul had persecuted him, who made him a fugitive who had to hide in the wilderness for years. But David knew back then how he resolved this conflict with Saul mattered as much, if not more, than the result. He knew he could stand firm because he knew he was righteous in the Lord's sight and that God would bring justice somehow. But as we heard last week, David has become shaped by arrogance, entitlement, weariness, and now he's the one who creates the conflict. Instead of trusting God to bring justice, David actively rejects justice. He tries to dismiss and deny his sins against God and others, even though his actions are evil in God's sight. God uses the prophet Nathan to open David's eyes, and he does confess his sin. God forgives him. And the text suggests that this story, this episode, is resolved. After all, David keeps the law and marries Bathsheba. They have another baby, and David this time goes out to personally lead his armies into battle, righting his previous wrong. Everything's good now, right? Most of the time that I ever heard these events preached, the preacher would also conclude our sermon by reminding us of God's grace if we confess our sin. But that isn't the end of the story. The story is far from over, and so are the consequences of David's sin. There's an instinct for us in our forgiven state to wrap up our own stories of sin, just like the narrator did. We've acknowledged the hard parts, which makes us feel authorized to tell a resolved version of the events. We want the version of history we remember to make us feel good when we tell it. But the truth is that all histories, whether they're personal, familial, church, or national, are not so neat and tidy. They're complicated, full of contradictions and best intentions, and we're not good at holding the entirety of that complexity. We like our heroes to be all good, our villains to be all bad. We like it when our country is on the right side of history and the version of our family that looks great is the one that's on a Christmas card. We're not good at sitting in the ongoing, unresolvable tension of life. I had the privilege of having wonderful relationships with both sides of my family when I was younger. I loved whenever we could spend time with my aunts and uncles and cousins, all my grandparents. I was proud to share our family histories of the places we'd overcome adversity or taken a stand for what was right, the ways that we had loved each other and could have fun together. As I started to grow up, I realized that there were just some parts of our family history that folks didn't talk about. Sometimes I'd catch whispers of phone calls or uncomfortable glances between adults and wonder what was going on. As I got even older, I noticed tensions between certain members of the family. It wasn't as perfect as it had seemed when I was a child, and over time I started to hear more of the whole family history. Different people had different memories of things that had happened, of conflicts that had taken place and had been dealt with poorly, and the effects that just spiraled out. Some folks were mad because they wanted justice for wrongdoing, for the offending party or parties to pay. Others wanted to suppress it for the sake of keeping the peace. But neither solution ever really helped the conflict resolve in restorative ways. I thought this was just something that was in my family until in seminary we created genograms. These are like family trees with extra information. Instead of just listing family relationships, you add details about the relationships in the family, getting into emotional and social dynamics. Things like how old people were when they got married or divorced or had affairs. The question of, were these relationships strong? Were there strong bonds? Or was there violence or alienation in relationships? What we found was that there were generational sins in every family. Places where relationships were broken in similar ways generation after generation. And even if there was confession about the sin, most families didn't know what to do beyond that point. Okay, it's out there, now what? Because, in families, you're holding the complicated history that includes both love and brokenness, the good and the bad, and it is so hard to reconcile the two. Families tend to ignore or suppress discussion of wrongdoing in order to maintain peace. We all show up at Christmas and pretend it's not awkward, or there could be a tendency towards hostility, estrangement, for instance, toward an offending family member. We all show up, except that one uncle or cousin. The fallout continues to manifest generations later, because sin is never just between us and God. Sin breaks the relationships between us and God and us and the rest of creation. In a spiritual way, unaddressed sin, like toxins in the soil, will eventually harm or damage whatever else grows there, even much later. Unresolved sin doesn't disappear, it metastasizes. In our families, sin produces fear and patterns of dysfunction that continue for generations. Maybe you can recognize some of this in your family. Poverty in one generation resulting in hoarding or rampant overworking or consumerism in the next. Abusive parenting that gives way to either overly permissive parenting or repeated abuse in the next. Infidelity can teach a person and a whole family not to really trust someone else, or it can create unhealthy overdependency in marriages that follow. And whether a family plays favorites or cuts off the black sheep, it can lead to jealousy, resentment, and insecurity among siblings. It's a family legacy, all right, just not the one that any of us wanted. There's no justice, and there's not true peace. And in David's story, the complexity of family history and national history come together. So buckle up, because we're going to get into it. In chapter 13, after some time, David's eldest son, Amnon, becomes obsessed with his sister Tamar. Because of social customs and familiar structure, Amnon doesn't have a way to actually spend time with Tamar. She would have lived under guard in the palace as a virgin daughter of the king, and Amnon would have lived in his own home, separate from the palace. But Amnon finds a way to fulfill his desires, right? He uses his power and his position to command Tamar to his home. And when she's there, he rapes her. Afterward, he uses his privilege to cover it up and deny his responsibility for his actions. Does this sound familiar? It should. Because knowingly or not, Amnon imitates his own father, David, to a T. And when David finds out, he does nothing. The text says that David literally refused to punish Amnon because he loved him as his eldest child. We can all understand loving someone despite doing something wrong, but nothing? David does nothing. There are literal Levitical laws and guidelines for how you should deal with a case of rape and sexual misconduct. There's a playbook he could have followed. Amnon could have been forced to marry Tamar. It might sound cruel, but without him, she wouldn't have been able to find a marriage prospect or have a child, which at the time would have been the only way to secure her legacy. Leaving her alone was guaranteeing her social erasure. Or, in Leviticus 18:9, we see that Amnon could have been removed from the community, even punished by death. David at least could have chosen to remove Amnon from the line of succession, suspending his royal status in some way. At least. But David does none of that. David does nothing. Why? Well, maybe it's because David has a history of addressing sin in private, but not in public. After all, when David sinned, he confessed and repented. But outside of Nathan and God, we don't see David ever being held accountable for how he uses his power, position, and privilege going forward. David doesn't get placed on probation. They don't convene a board for oversight. He doesn't abdicate his throne. Yes, he faced consequences privately and personally, but he never faced up to these things publicly or in regard to his public life. We can imagine that David feels shame seeing his son do the same thing that he did. And who is he to condemn his son when he himself has received forgiveness from God for doing the same thing? But that's terribly false logic. It sounds like a faithful response, but it's actually fear-based. Because it's rooted in shame, a shame that is only there because David never reckoned with how his sin impacted his family and his kingdom. Now, in trying to protect his legacy through his eldest son, David fails again. No justice, no peace. We might not be kings, but because of how many of us have been raised to think about sin, we treat it like it's something that exists only between us and God. We'll confess, but we don't routinely share outside of our relationship with God. Perhaps we're scared of what people will think of us when they hear the things that we've thought, said, or done. We're scared of what we'll lose if we're held accountable for our sin. I have to tell you all, as pastors, this is the thing we see in ourselves on staff and the thing that we see in our congregation so often too. We practice confession weekly in church as a community. But when it comes to offering those sins to our communities for accountability, we're terrified of what it might cost. But erasing or ignoring our history doesn't stop its consequences from unfolding. When we try to protect our legacy at the expense of our integrity, we get the very thing that we didn't want. As David's family story continues, Tamar's brother, Absalom, finds out that she's been raped, and he tells her to keep it quiet. He invites her to live with him since she would have lost her place in the king's palace after losing her status as a virgin. And Absalom, seeing that his father will do nothing about this injustice, decides to do something himself and waits for his moment. So 2 years later, Absalom and Amnon are on a journey to the countryside with all of the other princes in David's household. and Absalom orders his men to kill Amnon. Absalom uses his power and his privilege to deceive his target, and when the moment is right, he orders him to be killed by others. Absalom flees, a murderer on the run. Now, there are plenty of laws on how to deal with murderers, but again, David does nothing. David did the same thing to Uriah. He's ashamed of his own murderous deceit and mistakes that for mercy. So David welcomes Absalom back into the family. But this doesn't bring restoration. He really lost both sons that day, Amnon the rapist and Absalom the murderer, because David continues this pattern of not addressing wrongdoing against family members. He didn't address Amnon assaulting Tamar. He doesn't address Absalom murdering Amnon. David could not reconcile the complicated truth of his own family. No justice and no peace. I see that in families today and feel the temptation in my own parenting. When parents haven't dealt with their own shame around a sin, they cannot address it with their kids. They'll say, "Oh, how can I address this when I didn't do anything any better?" But doing nothing only seems to make things worse. The paralyzing fear of being called a hypocrite paradoxically paralyzes the family system in place. And David's inability to deal with his own stuff and subsequently his family's doesn't just lead to awkward dinners. It has national consequences for Israel, because David isn't just a dad, he's a king. So convinced that David is unable to execute real justice and bring about real peace, Absalom uses this as his pitch to be David's successor. He'd wait at the gate and intercept anyone who had a lawsuit. Absalom would say if he were king, he'd be able to offer judgment. He could help them, but the king won't. The people hear this and they begin to believe it, so that over time, Absalom wins the hearts of the people of Israel. Don't miss this, right? The people of Israel no longer hold David in high regard. His approval rating is sinking because he's known to be a leader who won't enact real justice and therefore cannot ensure real peace. Eventually, Absalom gathers supporters to overthrow David. And among those who join Absalom is none other than Ahithophel, one of David's closest advisors, who is also Bathsheba's grandfather. Don't miss this either now. Some of the people who joined this coup against David were some of the people who were closest to him in personal and political affairs. Why would they do this? Because they've seen David lose his grip on reality, lose his ability to lead well, and they want someone else in charge. Someone who can operate in reality. Just like he did in the beginning of his story, David has to flee to the wilderness. But unlike when he was escaping Saul, David is not innocent as he goes into the desert. After an exhausting back-and-forth campaign, David's army finally defeats Absalom's forces. But against David's wishes, David's general, Joab, kills Absalom too. David publicly grieves the death of Absalom until Joab, his general, tells him that killing Absalom is justice, that they've achieved peace. Joab reproaches David for mourning Absalom because it dishonors the soldiers who fought and died to secure David's throne. I think the last line of that little chunk of verses is so powerful. Joab chides David. Because he weeps for his lost son, he is loving one who hates him and hating ones who love him. If David wanted his family's legacy to be one of justice and peace, we can see in this moment that he has failed. After all, look at David's rule and reign. He's participated personally in engendering endless cycles of death and vengeance that don't feel like true justice. David's life wasn't very complicated at first. He had challenges, but life was simple. What got complicated were the trappings of power and of the legacy of the unhealed wounds of sin. And it prevented true peace. Friends, David was the greatest king that Israel ever knew. But he still could not reconcile the complication of his sin with his hopes for his legacy. He could not trust that the forgiveness he had received could create an opportunity for a new life. we might be living with the sort of comfort and access to the good life that our ancestors could have only dreamed about. But they were not perfect, and neither are we. We all have to wrestle with our complicated histories shaped by sin. But will we be like David, who's only able to wrestle with this at the end of his life after he's failed so tremendously at building the legacy he wanted? Or can we be people who start today while we're still living, who moved beyond confessing our brokenness to actively being healed from it so that the brokenness doesn't pass on to the next generation? At the end, David realizes that the only thing that matters about his legacy is the way that God moved through it, the places where he relied fully on the faithfulness of God instead of on his own power, privilege, and position. As he goes to his death with the hope that God will continue to move in more spectacular ways than God ever did through him. And he trusts one day God will heal every broken thing through the Messiah. And that is our hope, friends. In Matthew's gospel, he begins by tracing the lineage of Jesus and makes it clear that he is the son of David, the true king, the one who has come to do everything that David could not. And Matthew makes it clear that Jesus will do that by doing what David couldn't, living a life that was fully reliant on the faithfulness of God. Before he starts his public life, Jesus is tempted by everything that tends to turn us away from God, the things that break our relationship with God and with each other. To avoid poverty, Jesus, the tempter, says you need to use your power to create the food that you need so you won't die. But Jesus refused to use his power for the sake of having physical security, instead trusting that by abiding in God's way of life, he would find everything he needed. If part of your family's history was poverty or scarcity of resources, do you see a pattern of how money is treated, or which kinds of careers are seen as acceptable versus not? Often, experiencing the brokenness around poverty can lead to a pursuit of wealth as the legacy of a family's life. But in that pursuit, it's easy to lose sight of God's invitation to rely on him, to be satisfied with enough, and to see meeting the needs of our neighbors as something we are responsible for. It can make it painful to hear a call to economic justice, because you might remember or have heard stories about when your family didn't have enough. If justice means going back to that place, why would I choose that? We made it. It's our turn to enjoy the fruit of our labor. It's not wrong to want that, but it's not the full complicated story. Because often, one family's success can come at the expense of another's ability to live. Or perhaps you resonate with the temptation that's offered next. I think this was David's biggest fear. The offer for protection from getting hurt or being embarrassed. If you or your family were embarrassed or outcasts, very often the focus for your family would be on maintaining a good public image as the legacy. This means a high expectation of achievement or success and a low tolerance for imperfection. But in that pursuit, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we are all imperfect. The only one who is perfect is God. God already knows everything about us, including all the things that are embarrassing or shameful, and God still loves us. The call to be honest about our human imperfections publicly can be painful. Many of us can remember what it was like to be an outcast, to be judged. If peace means becoming a pariah, why would I choose that? Or maybe the last temptation is to never be controlled or manipulated again, because you are so powerful. Somewhere in your or your family's history, there's been an experience of abuse or high control. This might be the one you struggle with. There are parts of my story that come out of the other two temptations, and I certainly can resonate with them. But this is the one that I consistently wrestle with the most. Because I have experienced abuse at the hands of folks who've said that they loved me. It makes it really hard to trust anyone who has a lot of power or influence in general, let alone over me. In fact, I wonder if Absalom and Tamar felt the same. But in that pursuit of control, I can imagine the ways that through my power, I can execute justice that would stop the powerful from abusing more folks. I can imagine that it would bring about peace if I got to be in charge. It would be easy to turn away from learning to trust in God's control, to stop asking for what it means to follow God's way. But if I, or perhaps you, go about it like Absalom, if we're so convinced of our own power, we lose sight of the truth that God is the only one who is all-powerful, well, we'll eventually just become like the ones who abused us in the first place. As he was tempted in the desert, Jesus consistently refuses what the tempter has to offer by remembering that God is God. God is the one who creates, provides, protects, and sustains. We're just called to be human and live in right relationship with God. Being godly isn't trying to be God, but to rely on God instead. David didn't have a good example to follow about what it looked like to follow God as a king. He just had Saul, who had his own problems. Likewise, many times when we recognize brokenness in our families, we realize that we don't have an example to use to live differently in embodying real justice or peace. But thanks be to God that we aren't just looking to other people for how to be humans and follow God in this world. David might have been the greatest king Israel had ever known, but even he was waiting for Jesus, the Christ, who God sent to heal the brokenness in us and the world around us. But Christ didn't heal the world through his position, through powering up, or through abusing his privilege. Unlike David, Jesus never lived in a palace. He traveled and chose to abide with the outcasts of society. Unlike David, Jesus didn't hide the things that would garner criticism in his life. He knew that eating dinner with sinners, having a tax collector as an apostle, and treating women as equals would bring scorn. Yet, he made space at the table for both his supporters and those who questioned or even opposed him. He made everyone get to the heart of the matter together, and he was honest. Unlike David, Jesus never used his privilege to abuse others. He did the opposite. He permitted them to mock, beat, and crucify him. Our brokenness has created cycles of betrayal, humiliation, vengeance, and death. So Jesus endured all of that to show us the depths of God's great love for us. And through his resurrection shows us that not even the worst of what our sin can manufacture is able to stop God's reconciling, restoring love. So as people who claim that this love is the ultimate power, our response to sin doesn't stop at confession, but it begins there. We've been given a freedom in Christ through this love. We have a chance to follow Christ instead of continuing these cycles of sin. We don't get to force the rest of our families, our nation, or our church into breaking these cycles. But we can choose to do it ourselves. As Paul taught, as it's up to us, we should try to live at peace with everyone. If you want to move beyond confession and into a new pattern of living, my first encouragement to you is to spend some time getting to know Jesus. Spend time in the Bible looking at the life of Jesus. Study how he interacted with people and how he wielded his power. Notice how he broke the cycles of violence and fear that were so normalized in his world. Then identify where you are tempted to secure your own position, power, and privilege instead of following Jesus into sacrificial love. Confess that to God. After we confess to God, we have to confess to people who can actually hold us accountable to real life change. Give those folks permission to not let you off the hook easily. Allow them to ask you how it's going, to invite you again and again to live out of the love that you have been given, to give up control, to give up perfection, to give up security in anything other than God. Be honest about your failures. Be honest about the places where God is rewriting the story, rewriting your history to reflect love in new ways. There's a reason that I've shared some of the most embarrassing or vulnerable parts of myself up here. Why I share things that aren't all buttoned up but still in process. It's not because I like it. It's because I want you to know that the parts of my history that I'd rather keep quiet are actually places where God has met me and has offered me healing and reconciliation. And I want you to see that sharing those parts of my story, even if it's uncomfortable, doesn't wreck me. Because it doesn't change God's love for me and it doesn't change my worth. I have found freedom in not having to be perfect or strong enough, but to find my identity in being loved. I hope that that has been an encouragement to you to try and be honest about the complexity of who you are, both the broken and the loved, and a reminder to you that there is freedom in living in that tension. As I've reflected on the full and complicated history of the folks who've come before me, my spiritual and biological ancestors, I can see all the ways that they've screwed up. But the more that I follow Jesus, the more I am compelled to offer them compassion. They were trying to do the best that they could with the tools that they had. But life with Jesus means that I don't have to continue to operate the way that they did, to deal with the complicated stuff alone. I don't have to simply ignore it or just sweep it under the rug. We have the opportunity to follow the King who leads through loving the world around him, even the folks who hated him, even the folks who could never get it. So that means when others are able to confess their sin and commit to Jesus' way of love instead of more cycles of brokenness, I can't offer condemnation. I have to extend the same compassion that I've been given. Because the cycles of brokenness won't continue if they run out of fuel. When we face our fears of not having enough or not being enough, we can experience the radical transformative love of God. Just as Jesus receives us, we can receive each other as ones who are seen, known, and loved. I've decided that that's the only thing that matters about my legacy. That people would know more about God's love for them by the way that I love them. Then I don't need to disregard my history or seek to rewrite the future on my own. The complexity of my life, both the triumphs and the sins, stand in the shadow of the grace of the cross and the resurrection life. It is overwhelmed by the goodness of God. We are able to sit in the complexity with patience and compassion, telling a more truthful history because we have confidence in how it will end. Friends, my history, and our futures are being made new because of God, who reconciled himself through Christ and who gave us the work and ministry of reconciliation too. Go with that encouragement, friends, in the name of the Father and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.